She walked through those glass doors like gravity didn't apply to her. No employee badge dangling from a lanyard, no nervous glance toward security, just complete confidence wrapped in a vintage band tee and Balenciaga sneakers that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. I watched from my desk near the innovation lab, coffee halfway to my lips, as this stranger breezed past the front desk without so much as a pause. What caught my attention wasn't just her boldness. It was the fact that Leonard Holt himself, our notoriously distant CO, had come down from the executive floor to meet her. Leonard, who once made a VP wait 40 minutes in the lobby because he was reviewing quarterly projections, was now smiling like he'd won the lottery. His hand rested on her shoulder in that familiar way that told me everything I needed to know before anyone said a word. I set my coffee down slowly, watching them approach. The girl couldn't have been older than 23, maybe 24 at most. Her hair was styled in those effortless waves that took either natural perfection or 2 hours with a curling iron. She carried a designer tote bag covered in patches from brands I'd only seen on Instagram ads. Everything about her screamed curated authenticity, the kind you build when image is currency. They stopped 3 feet from my desk. She turned, tilted her head with practiced casualness, and her eyes locked onto mine. "You're Grace Vaughn, right?" Her voice had that rising inflection at the end, like a question, even though she clearly already knew the answer. If you're new here and enjoying these powerful stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more. Let me know in the comments what part of today's story touched you most. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. "That's me. Perfect." She smiled, revealing teeth so white they had to be professionally maintained. "I'm Zoe Holt. I'll be shadowing you for a bit while I get up to speed on the infrastructure." She paused, then added with theatrical innocence, "Uncle Leo says you're the best we've got." Uncle Leo. The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples I could already feel expanding. Leonard never called himself Leo. He barely acknowledged his own executive team's existence outside of board meetings. But here was his niece, using a nickname like they shared breakfast every Sunday. I forced a smile, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes. "Welcome aboard, Zoe. What's your background in systems architecture?" She laughed, light and airy. "Oh, I'm more of a big-picture person. Strategy, branding, user experience. The technical stuff isn't really my vibe, but I'm a fast learner." She pulled out her phone, already half distracted. "Anyway, Uncle Leo thought it would be good for me to understand how everything works before I step into a leadership role." Leadership role. My jaw clenched involuntarily. I'd spent 17 years building Helix Dynamics from a struggling startup into a powerhouse of predictive analytics and supply chain automation. 17 years of 80-hour weeks, emergency patches at 3 in the morning, and presentations to investors who barely understood what a server was. And now this girl, who'd probably never written a line of code in her life, was being groomed for leadership. Leonard cleared his throat, his smile still plastered across his face. "Grace, I'm counting on you to show Zoe the ropes. Give her full access to your projects. She needs to understand how we've built this company." He checked his watch, a Rolex that cost more than my annual bonus. "I've got a call with Tokyo. Zoe, I'll check in with you later." And just like that, he was gone. The elevator doors closed behind him, leaving me alone with a girl who looked at my desk setup like it was a museum exhibit from a bygone era. "So," Zoe said, settling into the empty chair beside my workstation without asking, "what exactly do you do here?" I stared at her for a long moment, processing the surreal nature of the situation. Then I reached for my coffee, took a slow sip, and began explaining the infrastructure that I'd spent nearly 2 decades perfecting. But in the back of my mind, a quiet alarm had already begun to sound. Something about this felt wrong. Very, very wrong. The email arrived at 8:47 the next morning. No subject line. Just a meeting request marked urgent, scheduled for 9 a.m. in conference room C, the one they only used for terminations and hostile acquisition discussions. My hands hovered over the keyboard, cursor blinking in the reply field, but I didn't respond. I already knew what this was. I arrived at 8:58, deliberately late enough to avoid small talk but early enough to appear professional. The door was already closed. Through the frosted glass I could make out 3 silhouettes. Leonard at the head of the table. Pauline from HR, her posture rigid and formal. And Zoe, sitting in what used to be the CTO's chair before he retired last year, her legs crossed, scrolling through her phone like she was waiting for brunch. I pushed the door open. 3 sets of eyes turned toward me. Only Pauline's held any trace of discomfort. "Grace," Leonard said, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "Please sit." I sat. The leather chair felt colder than usual, or maybe that was just my imagination projecting what I already suspected was coming. On the table in front of Leonard sat a manila folder, the kind that never contained good news. "Thank you for joining us on such short notice," he began, his tone measured and rehearsed. "I want to start by acknowledging everything you've contributed to Helix Dynamics. Your work has been instrumental in getting us to where we are today." Past tense. Instrumental. Getting us to where we are. Every word was carefully chosen, the language of someone who'd practiced this conversation with legal counsel. "However," he continued, and there it was, the pivot that preceded every corporate execution. "We're entering a new phase of growth. The board has been discussing our need to align with emerging market demographics. We need leadership that can speak to the next generation of clients, people who understand the cultural shift happening in technology." I glanced at Zoe. She was still looking at her phone, but a small smile played at the corner of her mouth. "We've decided to restructure the architecture division," Leonard said. "Zoe will be taking over as Director of Innovation and Infrastructure. She brings a fresh perspective that we believe will be invaluable moving forward." Director. The title I'd been promised 3 years ago, then told to wait for. The position I'd earned with every late night, every crisis averted, every impossible deadline met. And they were handing it to someone who couldn't explain the difference between a server and a service. Pauline slid a document across the table toward me. "We've prepared a comprehensive severance package. 6 months' salary, extended healthcare, and a recommendation letter. We think you'll find it quite generous." I looked down at the paper without touching it. My name was already typed at the bottom, next to a signature line. They'd prepared this before I even walked in. Maybe before they'd sent the meeting request. Maybe even before Zoe arrived yesterday. "When?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Leonard shifted in his seat. "We'd like to make this transition as smooth as possible. Today will be your last day. We'll need your badge and any company devices before you leave. IT will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Today. Not 2 weeks. Not even a courtesy transition period. Just immediate termination, dressed up in corporate language and sealed with a severance check." I finally looked directly at Zoe. She'd put her phone down and was watching me with curiosity, like I was an interesting specimen she was studying. "Do you even know what I built here?" I asked her. She shrugged, genuine confusion crossing her face. "I mean server stuff, right? Backend infrastructure? Uncle Leo said you did a great job setting up the foundation, but now we need someone who can take it to the next level. Someone who gets where technology is headed, not just where it's been." Where it's been. As if the entire architecture that powered their $870 million valuation was ancient history. As if predictive algorithms that processed millions of data points per second were somehow obsolete because they weren't packaged in a TikTok-friendly interface. I turned back to Leonard. "And my access? My credentials? Already revoked as of this morning," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Standard security protocol. This morning. Before the meeting. They'd locked me out before they'd even told me I was fired." I thought of my workstation, the servers I'd configured, the backup systems I'd designed. All of it sealed off, transferred to someone who probably thought cloud computing meant storing files on iCloud. I stood up slowly, deliberately. I didn't touch the severance papers. I didn't argue or plead or ask them to reconsider. I simply looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces, their body language, the casual cruelty of people who'd never built anything themselves. "I'll be out within the hour," I said. Pauline looked almost relieved. "Security will meet you at your desk to supervise. It's just procedure, nothing personal." Nothing personal. As if erasing 17 years of someone's life could be anything but personal. I walked out of that conference room with my head high and my hands steady. But inside, beneath the shock and the anger and the humiliation, something else was beginning to crystallize. Something cold and precise and patient. They thought they were removing a problem. They had no idea what they'd actually done. My desk had already been marked. A small cardboard box sat on top of my keyboard, the kind you see in movies when someone gets fired. How thoughtful of them to provide supplies for my humiliation. Two security guards stood nearby, trying to look casual but failing miserably. They were young, probably hired within the last year. They didn't even know who I was or what I'd built here. I moved mechanically, removing the framed photo of my sister's wedding, the coffee mug with "World's Okayest Engineer" printed on it, the small succulent that had somehow survived 3 years under fluorescent lighting. Personal effects. That's what HR called them. As if the real parts of me could be packed into a box and carried out in one trip. "Ma'am, we'll need your access badge," one of the guards said quietly. He looked uncomfortable, probably his first termination escort. I unclipped the badge from my belt and held it for a moment. Grace Vaughn, Senior Systems Architect, employee number 00047. I'd been the 47th person hired at Helix Dynamics. There were over 3,000 employees now. I'd interviewed and trained at least 200 of them myself. I handed him the badge without a word. "And your laptop and phone," he added. I unplugged the laptop, closed it carefully and placed it on the desk. The phone followed. Both devices contained nothing personal anyway. I'd always kept my work and personal technology separate, a habit from my early days in cybersecurity. Trust no network you don't control yourself. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the real architecture didn't live on company devices. It lived in my head, in the documentation I'd carefully maintained, in the backup systems I'd designed with redundancies they'd never approved but I'd implemented anyway because I actually cared about stability. I picked up my box and walked toward the elevator. Employees I'd worked with for years suddenly found their screens fascinating. A few offered weak smiles. No one said goodbye. Corporate fear is contagious. If they acknowledged me, they might catch whatever disease had gotten me fired. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside, the guards flanking me like I might make a run for the server room. As we descended, I caught my reflection in the polished steel doors. I looked exactly the same as I had an hour ago. Same dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Same minimal makeup. Same sensible flats and navy cardigan. But something in my eyes had changed. A sharpness. A clarity. We reached the ground floor. The guards escorted me through the lobby, past the reception desk where Zoe had walked in so confidently yesterday. The morning sun hit my face as we stepped outside. They watched me get into my car, probably making sure I actually left the premises. I sat in the driver's seat box on the passenger side and pulled out my personal phone. My real phone. The one that had never touched Helix Dynamics network. I opened a secure note-taking app and began typing, not from memory but from perfect recall. Server configurations. Access protocols. The location of every redundancy I'd built. And most importantly, the ghost admin account I'd created 5 years ago during a security audit when I discovered that our backup recovery system had a critical flaw. I'd fixed the flaw, but I'd also created a failsafe, a master key that could access everything locked behind encryption that only I knew how to break. Standard practice for any good architect. You always leave yourself a way back in just in case. Just in case of catastrophic failure, just in case of hostile takeover, just in case of emergency. Or just in case you get fired and replaced by someone who doesn't know what she's doing. I wasn't planning revenge. Not yet. I was simply taking inventory of what I knew, what they'd forgotten to ask for when they revoked my access. They got my badge and my laptop, but they couldn't revoke my knowledge. They couldn't extract the 17 years of experience I'd accumulated, the intimate understanding of every system weakness, every backdoor, every critical dependency. I started the car and drove away from Helix Dynamics, probably for the last time as an employee. But in my mind, I was already mapping pathways they didn't know existed, seeing the infrastructure from angles they couldn't imagine. They'd removed me from the building. They hadn't removed me from the system. Not yet.my apartment felt too quiet. I'd grown so accustomed to the constant hum of servers, the ping of notifications, the background noise of a busy office that silence felt almost aggressive. I set the cardboard box on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long moment, as if it might explain what had just happened. Then I did what any good engineer does when faced with a problem. I started gathering data. I pulled out my personal laptop, the one with encryption so thorough that even government agencies would have trouble cracking it, and began searching through my archived files. Years of documentation, carefully maintained and backed up to 3 separate secure locations. Emails. Contracts. Technical specifications. And then I found what I was looking for. The intellectual property assignment agreement from 2019. I remembered that day clearly. Helix Dynamics had just closed their Series C funding round, bringing in $200 million from venture capital firms who wanted assurances that all technology belonged exclusively to the company. Legal had sent out a mass email requiring all technical staff to sign updated IP agreements, transferring complete ownership of any code, systems, or innovations to Helix. Most people signed immediately. I'd read the document carefully, then replied with concerns. The language was too broad, encompassing not just work done on company time but anything tangentially related to my field. It would have given them ownership of side projects, personal research, even theoretical concepts I'd explored on weekends. I'd requested modifications. Specifically, I wanted acknowledgement that the core architecture I'd developed, the predictive analytics engine that processed supply chain data, had been partially conceived before I joined Helix Dynamics. It was based on research I'd done for my master's thesis, refined and improved over years of independent work. Legal had pushed back. We'd gone through 3 rounds of revisions. They'd insisted that signing was mandatory, that refusing would be seen as insubordination. I'd calmly explained that if they wanted my signature, the document needed to accurately reflect reality. I wasn't trying to claim ownership of everything, just proper attribution for what I'd brought with me. The thread had gone silent. They'd never followed up. And in the chaos of rapid growth, acquisitions, new product launches, and constant firefighting, everyone had apparently forgotten, including their legal team. I opened the document now, reading through it again with fresh eyes. The signature field at the bottom remained blank. Unenforceable. And buried in my archived email was a message from their own counsel, dated November 2019, stating, per Grace Vaughn's employment contract and the nature of her pre-existing research, explicit signature is required for complete IP transfer. Until documentation is properly executed, ownership of core architectural components may be contested under California employment law. I read that line 3 times, feeling something cold and sharp taking shape in my chest. They'd built an $870 million company on infrastructure I'd designed. They'd just fired me and handed control to someone completely unqualified. And they'd never actually secured legal ownership of the foundation everything ran on. I pulled up another document. My original employment contract from 17 years ago, when Helix had been 6 people working out of a converted warehouse. The IP clause was minimal, focused only on work done using company resources during company time. Nothing about pre-existing knowledge. Nothing about research I'd brought with me. I sat back in my chair staring at the screen. This wasn't just a technical advantage. This was a legal bomb waiting to detonate. But I didn't move immediately. I didn't fire off angry emails or contact lawyers or post on social media about unfair treatment. Instead, I did what I always did best. I planned. I documented. I prepared. I created a new folder on my encrypted drive and titled it simply, Evidence. Inside, I placed copies of the unsigned IP agreement, the email from legal counsel, my original employment contract, and time-stamped documentation of every major system component I'd designed, complete with version histories that predated my employment at Helix. Then I opened another file, one I'd been maintaining for years without really knowing why. A complete map of the Helix infrastructure, including admin access points, redundancy protocols, and the ghost account I'd created during that security audit. Account name, system root, location, buried in the disaster recovery subnet, hidden behind 3 layers of authentication that appeared to be standard security protocols but were actually custom implementations only I fully understood. I logged into my personal VPN, routed through 2 proxy servers, and accessed the Helix network remotely using credentials that shouldn't have worked anymore. But they did because the ghost account existed outside the standard authentication system. It was invisible to normal admin tools, designed to be activated only in catastrophic scenarios. Like this one. The system dashboard loaded. I could see everything. Server status, active users, data processing loads, backup schedules. And there, logged in with my old credentials that should have been disabled, was Zoe's account. She was currently accessing the main interface, clicking through menus, probably trying to figure out what everything meant. I watched her cursor move erratically across the screen, opening and closing windows, running basic diagnostic commands that any first-year IT student would know. She was lost. Completely, utterly lost. And she was now responsible for systems that powered supply chains for 17 Fortune 500 companies. I logged out carefully, clearing my access trail, and closed the laptop. I didn't do anything destructive. Not yet. I was simply observing, documenting, waiting. Because the thing about building complex systems is that they're stable only when maintained by people who understand them. Remove the architect, replace them with someone who doesn't know what they're doing, and eventually, inevitably, things begin to break. I didn't need to sabotage anything. I just needed to wait for gravity to do its work. 3 weeks passed. I'd settled into an uncomfortable routine. Mornings spent updating my resume, afternoons fielding recruiter calls, evenings monitoring Helix dynamics from the outside. I'd set up automated alerts tracking their public-facing systems, watching for signs of instability. So far, everything appeared normal. Their website loaded smoothly. Their API endpoints responded correctly. To external observers, nothing had changed. But I knew better. Surface stability meant nothing when the foundation was cracking. On a Tuesday morning, I was sitting at my favorite coffee shop, the one with decent Wi-Fi and baristas who didn't judge people for camping out all day with a single latte, when my phone buzzed. Not a normal notification. An alert from one of my monitoring scripts. Helix Dynamics server response time. Critical threshold exceeded. I pulled out my laptop, connected to the coffee shop's Wi-Fi through my VPN, and pulled up the monitoring dashboard. What I saw made my breath catch. Their primary data processing servers were experiencing cascading failures. Response times had spiked from milliseconds to full seconds. For systems that handled real-time supply chain decisions, that kind of latency was catastrophic. It meant trucks weren't being routed. Inventory predictions were stalling. Millions of dollars in logistics decisions were frozen in digital amber. I checked the system logs through my Ghost access. The problem was immediately obvious to anyone with basic understanding of the architecture. Someone, and I could guess who, had modified the load balancing algorithm. They'd changed core parameters, probably thinking they were optimizing the system without understanding how those parameters interacted with the redundancy protocols. It was like removing a support beam from a building because it didn't match the aesthetic you wanted. The system was trying to compensate, shifting loads between servers, but the modified algorithm was creating bottlenecks instead of resolving them. In another hour, maybe less, the entire infrastructure would lock up completely. And when it did, 17 Fortune 500 companies would simultaneously lose access to their supply chain management systems. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Grace Vaughn. The voice was male, slightly frantic, vaguely familiar. Speaking. This is Derek Palmer. I'm the interim CTO at Helix. We met briefly at the company holiday party 2 years ago. I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation and nobody here seems to know how to. Let me guess, I interrupted. Your servers are choking. Response times are through the roof. And you're about to have a complete system failure. Silence. Then, how did you know? Because I built that system. And I'm watching it collapse in real time. I kept my voice neutral, professional. No anger, no satisfaction, just statement of fact. Can you help us? The desperation in his voice was palpable. We'll pay consulting rates, whatever you want. We just need someone who understands the architecture. I pulled up the server logs. The fix would take 10 minutes. I could save them from the chaos Zoe had caused by blindly changing settings she didn't understand. Or I could let it burn. Grace, please, Derek begged over the phone. 3,000 employees had nothing to do with this decision. They'll lose their jobs if the company fails. He was right. But this wasn't just about one mistake. It was proof they'd built an empire on a foundation they couldn't maintain. I'll think about it, I said. Call you back in 15 minutes. I hung up before he could protest. My laptop showed the system spiraling, error messages piling up, servers buckling under flawed logic, fail-safes failing because Zoe's changes broke the recovery protocols. It was a slow-motion collapse, inevitable and self-inflicted. Derek texted, "People's livelihoods are at stake." I stared out the window. Ordinary lives went on, unaware that Helix was moments from ruin. All because leadership chose connections over competence. I could restore everything with a single call. Be the hero. Maybe even get my job back. Or I could make them face the truth. I opened my terminal, Not to fix it but to document every failure, every change Zoe made, every warning ignored. Evidence of what happens when expertise is replaced by privilege. Then I closed the laptop and waited. The calls came, Derek, HR, probably Leonard, but I let them go to voicemail. My monitoring alert sounded again. Critical systems were now in catastrophic failure. Servers were shutting down autonomously to prevent data corruption. Recovery would take weeks if ever. Zoe texted, "Please help me fix it." "I'm sorry." I replied, "You wanted to lead infrastructure. This is what leadership looks like when you don't understand the systems you're responsible for." She wasn't wrong about the consequences. But she wasn't my responsibility anymore. The system had minutes left. There was one final move. I transferred the core architecture documentation to my encrypted storage and wiped every copy from their servers. Then I deactivated the backup systems, just long enough to let the collapse run its course. Finally, I accessed the master control server and changed one line of code. A single parameter in the core algorithm, flipping a 1.0 to 0.0. 5 seconds. 5 keystrokes. The entire $870 million infrastructure still looked online, but every calculation now returned 0. It was over. Derek called, panicked. "Servers are running but nothing's processing. All outputs are 0. Do you know what's happening?" "Yes," I said calmly. "You wanted new leadership, fresh perspectives. Now you have a system that reflects the depth of understanding of the person you put in charge. You sabotaged us." "No. I took back what was mine. You never secured legal ownership of the foundation your business was built on. Check the unsigned IP agreement. Check my contract. The architecture belongs to me." I hung up just as a cease and desist letter arrived. I replied with the evidence and a simple offer. License the technology back at $500 per hour, 2,000-hour minimum. 2 days later, after ignoring a flood of desperate calls, I received a voicemail from Catherine Reeves, lead investor at Apex Ventures. "Helix is finished," she said. "Leonard made the worst decision I've seen in 20 years. He replaced irreplaceable expertise with nepotism. She proposed a new company, fully funded, fully owned by me. $50 million to rebuild it all, the right way." Catherine Reeves, the lead investor from Apex Ventures, called with a clear proposition. Helix was finished and she wanted to fund Grace to build a successor company. "Leonard Holt made the single worst business decision I've seen," she said. "He fired the one person who understood the company's core value." She offered $50 million in funding for Grace to rebuild her architecture from scratch, retain 40% equity, and capture the market need Helix had abandoned. Grace considered the employees who would lose their jobs. Catherine acknowledged their plight but stated, "The rest will learn an important lesson about loyalty to competence over incompetent leadership." When asked about Zoe, Catherine replied bluntly, she'd become a cautionary tale on LinkedIn and would never handle serious infrastructure again. Grace agreed to review the contracts her attorney had already vetted, securing full IP ownership and control. "Send me the contracts," Grace said. "I'll review them with my attorney." "Excellent," Catherine replied. "Come up with a name for the company. Something that means something to you." "Cornerstone Systems," Grace answered after 3 seconds. "Perfect. Because you're going to be the cornerstone of something much bigger than Helix ever was." After the call, Grace opened a fresh document titled Cornerstone Systems Technical Architecture Proposal. This time she wasn't building someone else's dream. She was building hers. The news cycle quickly turned against Helix, exposing the unsigned IP agreement, Zoe's lack of qualifications, and internal objections to Grace's firing. The company lost $730 million in valuation within a week. Grace declined most media requests but gave one key interview, framing her actions as the inevitable consequence of replacing expertise with nepotism. "I didn't fire those people," she said. "Leonard Holt did the moment he prioritized nepotism over competence. The collapse was inevitable. I just accelerated the timeline." While the debate raged online, Grace signed the contracts and officially became CEO of Cornerstone Systems. Within days she leased office space, recruited loyal engineers who had left Helix, and scheduled meetings with desperate former clients. She worked long hours not out of obligation but passion, building a system better than before, designed right from the first line of code. 3 weeks later, Derek texted, "I'm leaving Helix. Last day is Friday. I should have stood up for you when it mattered. I'm sorry." I reached out to Derek after he texted his resignation from Helix. He tried to help during the crisis and had opposed my firing. Cornerstone needs a CTO who understands infrastructure and has integrity. "Interested?" I asked. He responded immediately, "I'd be honored. But are you sure?" "I'm sure," I replied. "Send your resume. Let's talk." He did, and by week's end he'd accepted the role, our first executive hire who truly understood both tech and business. It wasn't forgiveness. It was progress. 6 weeks later, Leonard called personally. His voice was hollow, stripped of its old authority. "I made a catastrophic mistake," he admitted. "I destroyed what you built. I'm sorry." "You didn't build it," I corrected. "And there's nothing left to fix. Helix is finished." He asked about Zoe. I cut him off. "She made her choices. Let her face them." After a long silence, he whispered, "I understand now. Everything you built." "Goodbye, Leonard." I hung up, feeling not anger or triumph, but closure. My phone buzzed. "Catherine, Indigo Maritime signed with Cornerstone. $42 million annual value." I smiled. One of Helix's biggest clients, now mine, not for price but for proven expertise. "Let's discuss expansion," I texted back. "We're ready to scale." It was just the beginning. Helix had collapsed under incompetence. Cornerstone would rise on merit. When the Innovation Awards invitation arrived, I almost declined. But this wasn't about ego. It was about visibility. Derek poked his head in. "Catherine says you should go. She heard they're announcing Helix's liquidation at the event." I looked at the invite. 6 months ago I walked out with a cardboard box. Now I was being recognized by the same industry that once celebrated Leonard. "Tell Catherine I'll be there," I said. "And Derek, make sure our team is ready. If we're nominated, we win." The gala was in full swing when I arrived. Catherine found me immediately, elegant in black. "Grace, you clean up nicely." "I know how to dress," I said dryly. "I just chose not to at Helix." "Smart," she smiled. "Save it for when it matters." I moved through the crowd. Handshakes, business cards, the usual corporate dance. Everyone wanted to meet the woman who'd taken down a billion-dollar company and built something better from the wreckage. Then I saw them, Leonard and Zoe near the bar, looking like ghosts at their own funeral. Our eyes met. Shame flickered across his face. I looked away. I had nothing left to say to him. The awards began. We took our seats, Derek, Catherine, my team. People I trusted. People who knew competence mattered more than connections. When they announced Innovation of the Year and called Cornerstone's name, the room erupted. I stood, smoothed my jacket and walked to the stage. The crystal obelisk felt solid in my hands. "Thank you," I said into the microphone. "This award is for 6 months of work by an incredible team. But it's also proof that expertise matters. That experience has value. That real systems are built by people who understand them, not by those who inherited the role." I paused, seeing Leonard staring at his lap. 6 months ago I was fired from a company I helped build for 17 years. Replaced by someone whose only qualification was her last name. And it collapsed, not because I sabotaged it but because they never understood what made them valuable. They thought they owned my work. They were wrong. The room was silent. Cornerstone exists because of that mistake. Because I was freed from an organization that didn't value knowledge. It exists to prove that the best technology comes from skill, dedication, and earned authority, not connections or birthright. I held up the award. This is for everyone who's been overlooked, dismissed, told their expertise was replaceable. For everyone who built something great only to watch others take credit. Keep building. Keep fighting. Keep proving them wrong. The applause was thunderous. Back at my table, Catherine leaned in. "You just became the face of merit over nepotism." "I just told the truth," I said. "Same thing." Later near the exit, Zoe stopped me. Her eyes were red. I was wrong. About everything. I wasn't qualified. I broke something valuable because I was too arrogant to admit I didn't know what I was doing. "You did," I said. "Is there anything I can do to make it right?" "Learn. Understand that connections aren't competence. That taking roles you're unqualified for doesn't just hurt you, it hurts everyone who depends on you. Real expertise takes years. There are no shortcuts. She nodded. I'm taking night classes. CS fundamentals. Programming. Good. That's a start. But don't expect trust to come back fast. You destroyed your reputation before you built one. Rebuilding takes time. I know. She wiped her eyes. I'm sorry. For everything. Apology noted. Now go learn. And next time someone offers you a job you're not ready for, have the integrity to say no. I walked out. Derek and Catherine waited by the car. Ready to celebrate? Derek asked. I looked back at the glittering hotel. Actually, I'd rather go back to the office. I have a new design I want to finish. Catherine laughed. You just won Innovation of the Year and you want to work? That's why we won, I said. Because I care about the work more than the award. They went to celebrate. I went to my office, turned on my computer and opened my design files. The award sat on my desk, catching the light. Beautiful. Meaningful. But not the point. I didn't build systems for trophies or revenge. I built them because I'm good at it. Because solving complex problems, creating something elegant and functional, that's where I belong. Helix forgot that. They thought once the foundation was laid, anyone could maintain it. They learned otherwise. Leonard tried to erase me. Instead he set me free. And that, more than any applause, any recognition, any victory, was the sweetest triumph of all.